One of the most challenging aspects of learning anatomy or learning to draw figures and characters is how do you connect everything together? It's one thing to kind of understand how to draw a leg or a arm or the torso, etc. But it's often when we try and connect these things up that things become more complicated. What I want to do in this video is unpack how we think about connecting the leg to the pelvic area and the torso so that we can understand how to draw this when characters are posed and moving around. How do you connect the leg to the rest of the body? Now, I am a professional comic book artist and I have to draw figures all day, every day. It's literally what I do as a job, but my style is unique. It's a little bit more simplified, and what I want to do in this video is talk a little bit more about how I would do this, but also combine that with looking at, a number of anatomy books. So we've got a few sort of different texts that we're going to sort of come at this problem from, slightly different angles. So we'll sort of look at how this subject is discussed in general, try and think about the forms, and then I'll really sort of show you how I do this day in, day out. We'll really focus on primary form and how to get the sort of figure posed nicely. I think that often the real trick to this is getting the primary form, the relationship between sort of where the leg and the torso need to be. I think what you'll find is if you kind of get that sorted, then it becomes a lot easier to figure out where to put some of those secondary anatomical markers. So most of it starts with just basic proportion, primary form. How do we get this thing moving? How do we connect it together and make it sort of not look a little bit funny and awkward? Anyway, let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name's Mcburnie. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. Now, if you'd like to learn more about line and color illustration, how I do what I do day in, day out, the basics, you can check out my free quick start guide. It's aimed to get you up and running quickly, developing your own line and color process. I'll give you all of the brushes and Photoshop documents and most of the things that, I actually use day in, day out to create the work that I create. This one, my R book, is a little bit more sort of complicated. It's got some painted backgrounds and a few other things like that, but a lot of the stuff I've been doing more recently is really simple and flat. So again, often what I recommend is just get yourself a really simple, reliable process, and that's what that quick start guide is aimed to do. It's free. The link will be in the description. All right, so tools for today are some Ecochet and skeleton models from anatomytools.com. I've got some Blackwing matte pencils. I have also this Mitsubishi sort of vermilion Prussian blue two-stage, like 50-50 pencil that, is quite useful. I'm going to be drawing on some Strathmore 400 series smooth drawing paper, which is, again, pretty good for being able to hack up, redraw, etc. And I'll probably be using a kneadable eraser or something like that if I need. So first up, what I want to do is actually look at how, often this idea is sort of dealt with in different anatomy books. All right, so we've got a couple of different things to give us some different flavors. One is Figure Drawing for All It's Worth by Andrew Loomis. Next, we've got Dynamic Figure Drawing by Bern Hogarth. That's a classic. And this is, again, very similar sort of ideology. Gottfried Bem's The Complete Guide to Anatomy for Artists and Illustrators. Very different takes on this idea. And again, a big part of, just sort of sharing this is to just talk about how books often describe anatomy, but often what you have to do is really figure out how you employ it in your art, depending on what your style is. But anyway, first up, let's just have a look at dynamic figure drawing. What does Bern Hogarth say about connecting these things? So Hogarth is definitely drawing and teaching within the constructive anatomy sort of paradigm, which, as I often say, is similar to what Loomis or Bridgman, etc. is doing. This is essentially the same information that has been handed down through ateliers for hundreds and hundreds of years, going back to Da Vinci, Michelangelo, etc. And a lot of it is about breaking things down into primary form. Now, one of the things that I think you'll sort of notice if you're astute is that I think Bern Hogarth actually is probably his weakest point is his interconnections, right? It's sort of how he connects one thing to another isn't, I would say, the strong point. But I think he is really good at breaking down the form and giving us some nice sort of drawings that will help illustrate this point. Now, really, when we're dealing with the pelvis / torso / leg, it's the idea of the pelvic bones and how the musculature of the sort of torso connects to those pelvic bones, right? So we're typically dealing with this idea. We have a sort of pelvic bone here, and what happens is all of these muscles come down and they kind of attach to the pelvic bone, right? Again, just sort of calling this thing this sort of pelvic cradle thing. And I think the real trick is that when this moves, all of these things interact with each other. So this really is the challenge, and it's why this area often seems a little bit awkward, because we have to sort of deal with the abdominals, right? There are these sort of bones which sometimes are, sort of going to be covered by, muscle, etc. And then you have what, it's like, okay, that's hard enough. Next, we got to then, join up all of the leg muscles with those same points. And it creates a huge amount of complexity, and there's a lot of deformation that happens there. Luckily for us, that normally this is actually covered by clothing. And when it's not, often there's actually only a few things you really need to find in terms of the anatomical lines or forms that you're going to render. And we'll look at that in a little bit. And I'll also sort of, dive into, what so a few artists, tend to do and sort of use that as an example. I'll sort of use Frazetta as a good example of that. But again, here you can see the basic sort of idea that you would find in most anatomy books, which is that we kind of have to deal with the abdominals. We have the sort of hip bone here that you can kind of see hidden. And he has quite a few sort of good examples here where, we're really starting to sort of break down how these primary forms are going to work. Although, again, these are kind of secondary forms as well, right? But yeah, that's a sort of a good indication of how a lot of this would work. And I think, again, a good sort of example of how we need to think about the interaction between the torso and the pelvic area. There's lots of ideas here, but the real problem, as I said, with this specific idea of how to connect one thing to another is that we have multiple masses of muscles connecting to each other. And if you don't sort of get it all right, it tends to fall apart. But here you can see this really is a lot of the musculature that we're going to have to work with. And Hogarth has his own sort of much more, I would say, sort of rounded. He was known for what you'd sort of call the beauty lines, or these kind of flowy lines. And if you look at his comic book work, he's quite an accomplished comic book artist who drew a lot of Tarzan, etc. And his work looks very, very similar to this. Super consistent, super solid. But again, a little bit, like an action figure. The way these things connect is very sort of mechanical, right? But a very, very functional artist, right? Very accomplished, professional. But again, he can deal with, he can see the sort of stuff we're going to have to deal with. But yeah, let's see what, again, a few different other types of anatomy books are going to give us when we're looking at this area. All right, so if we look at Gottfried Baum's Complete Guide to Anatomy, one of the challenges with this book is it has a lot of quite useful photos in it, but they do show a lot of sort of nudity, often sort of full frontal nudity. So I'm sort of, it's not the kind of thing I can really sort of show on YouTube all over the place without potentially running into trouble. But again, I think what you sort of see is again a very sort of similar idea, although this really is about sort of looking at the constructive anatomy, again, almost like the primary form of those sort of pelvic areas. And this is really a big part of what will help us understand what's going on here, is simplifying and understanding the relationship between the pelvis, the leg, and the torso, right? Because it's often, again, this connection that we have to deal with. So it's understanding what those primary forms are and then understanding how to connect them up. Now, one of the challenges that I often find, looking at a lot of anatomy books, is they're very good at this sort of static explanation of what's going on. And I think that's the best way to sort of read and understand what's sort of happening, is that there are many, many, many important ideas here. But these drawings are done mostly to demonstrate these ideas. They're not necessarily a how you should draw. It is a demonstration and a rendering of the idea personified as a drawing. So that's why often, these things are being made simpler to describe the fact that, like, look, hey, this is what we need to pay attention to. Here again, I think this really well illustrates a lot of the subtlety that you have to deal with when it comes to the pelvis. And I think this is a great sort of photographic sequence where it seems like there's actually a line drawn on the model. And you can kind of see as the character sort of moves, right, the difference you can have in the pelvic rotation depending on just how you're standing, right? These are all upright positions, but they're going to give you very different shapes, right? And again, just describing that with this little sort of illustration there is really, really useful. So again, I find that often these anatomy books are super useful to have, right? Really, really clever descriptions of what's sort of happening. You can look at these and understand a lot, right? So, people are always like, because I'm often really keen on the Loomis books, which is what we'll sort of look at next. And people are often sort of saying, like, why so much into Loomis? Well, mostly because I feel like the drawings are a little bit nicer. Again, there's no photos, so it's a little bit easier to sort of present. But yeah, really the answer is you just buy them all, right? There's not that many, really, really good anatomy books. And, that's sort of the approach I took, and just sort of see, if you can get a percent of information here and a percent of information there, you combine it all together, and that kind of helps you out. So it's less about following a method and just sort of understanding what these things will give you. Now, one of the things, as I often see, Loomis does really well is explains this with the mannequin system, which I think is getting a little bit closer to where I like to be in terms of trying to talk and teach about this stuff, which is, how do you actually do it? It's one thing to kind of say, oh, hey, see how this muscle goes here, this moves. When we're dealing with this complexity, we need a system. We need a way to break down this form. And that's why, again, I'm often sort of really keen on the Loomis books, because they talk about breaking these things down from that sort of basic mannequin point of view. And this gives us a hint about sort of how we can start, right? How we can progress from sort of one thing to another thing. And I think it really sort of solves a lot of these issues which you can run into as a beginner trying to learn how to, put these bits and pieces together and actually, go from, okay, I don't have, a reference, I don't have anything, but how do I kind of put this stuff together and actually learn how to draw? So again, let's sort of check out what we're actually trying to do, right? Let's look at maybe a bit of artwork and sort of see, okay, like this is sort of the information that's out there. How do I actually put it into practice? Okay, so I pick Frazetta because I think Frazetta is a good example of someone who is going to have a good mix of exaggerated and realistic anatomy, and also is going to draw a lot of people with not many clothes on. One of the things that you will find is that even though the proportion and getting the arrangement of these things sorted is really important, very, very frequently you don't actually need to, figure out exactly how or where to draw these things, because they're covered up. And they're either covered up because artists tend to cover them up so that it's easier, or they're covered up because people typically are wearing clothes. You really have to consider the drawing problem of connecting the torso to the legs as being very specific to what angle, or what sort of viewpoint you are sort of taking. Is it on the side? Is it on the front? Right? Is it from the back? You're going to have to find a lot of different lines, and that really is our goal, is to be able to kind of find the different lines here. Again, you'll find in most cases this area is going to be covered up. You don't actually need to figure out, all of the things there. Most of the time, it's really only, when you have a very specific sort of pose, you know, one of these sort of classic sort of erotica style poses, right, where you can see a lot of the anatomy there. But it's actually very rare unless you're specifically doing cheesecake or pin-up style art, or, you know, not safe for work style art anyway. But again, there's a couple of lines here which, again, are really the goal of what we're trying to find when it comes to drawing this particular area of the body. So let's start with a few different solutions or ways you could go about this. To begin with, we could just sort of look at how the idea of the skeleton, right, and the musculature function. But most of the time, what you're actually going to be thinking about is sort of what are those primary forms, right? So if we think about, again, the idea of those primary forms, which are going to help us understand what goes where, again, we're often dealing with these very simple anatomical markers and abstractions. So what we're trying to do, again, right, is sort of think about simplifying and understanding this particular area, and then understanding how do we actually connect the leg there. So the best way to sort of think about this pelvic area is it's kind of like a cup, right? It's sort of it's a bucket that's holding all of your guts and stuff like that, which is, again, a pretty gross way to think about it. But what it does is it sort of serves to connect the top and the bottom body together, and all of the muscles that are sort of, you know, in the abdominal area tend to connect here somewhere. That's why it's got this weird shape. And again, all of the muscles of the legs connect there as well. So these ones reach up, these ones reach down. In order to be able to pose it, right, and sort of figure out, okay, like, how do I sort of, you know, wrap all these muscles around, we really do need to start with the anatomy. But what you'll find is that understanding the primary form and how that moves can help as well. So let's look at some different options and different solutions for how we might actually think about this. So the more sort of Loomis mannequin methodology here, again, I'm always like drawing that torso a little bit off, right? The more sort of Loomis mannequin style here is going to be about thinking about the skeleton, but we simplify it. So we have, again, this sort of pelvic area here, right? And then we have where, right, we've got where the ball of the hip goes. But then you see it kind of comes out. Right, if we think about this bone, you can kind of see that it's, right, boom, right, comes down there, and it's like a big old, you know, like a dog's bone sort of thing. And up the top, right, it's sort of got like this giant ball and socket joint. Right, something out of engineering class, and that sort of goes within, right, the socket of the pelvis. And again, when you get a hip replacement, again, this is often what people are talking about. That sort of gets replaced. So this is what we need to think about, because it's often a little bit deceptive, because the connection point and the pivot point is not necessarily in line with the bone itself. So this is a critical point. There's a couple of really key anatomical points here that I think are worthwhile. One is the bottom of the rib cage, right? It's this guy, right? What's happening here? The second is the top of the pelvic bone, and the other one is the pivot point for the sort of leg bone, and the other is with this sort of side of the leg bone that you actually often see, right? You can often actually see this in the naked figure. So again, what we're dealing with is something that's coming out. I'll move that over a little bit, and I'm just going to exaggerate this for the sake of it. Right, so it's almost like we're dealing with this, right, sort of separation. And again, depending on the male and female figure, again, the pelvis, the pelvic sort of bone is going to be higher or lower, etc. And again, that will change depending on what sort of rotation we're using. I'm being very simple here. So if we think about this, but we, keep in mind where these pivot points are, then it becomes a little bit easier to, manipulate where that bone might be going. And it's just important to remember, again, it sort of pivots a little bit in here, and then the leg kind of stands out. And if we understand that and get that sorted, then a lot of the posing and other elements will take care of themselves. And this, I think, is at the core of, a big part of what, will tend to make things awkward. So understanding this general sort of posing, the hip, position of the pelvis, position of the rib cage, how we connect all those things up. Super, super useful. And that's where a lot of those anatomy books will help. Often, however, what you're actually dealing with is thinking about these primary forms. And that's where what we can sort of do is draw things a little bit more as if they were one of those wooden puppets. Right, so this is where it can be a little bit more useful to think about the primary forms that tend to pervade this area, right? And that's where we can kind of think about right, what are the forms there? What are the shapes there? How do these function? How do these work? Boom, boom, boom. And if we sort of get these happening, then we can also say, well, what's typically over here? It's going to be, almost like a big ovoid shape like that, except we sort of cut a little bit off here. Right, so we're going to have another sort of shape that's going to look something like that. And I'm not really drawing male or female or anything. This is just kind of like fairly derpy anatomy style rendering stuff. So what we're thinking about here is, again, this form versus this form. And this is often actually, what we end up drawing and really considering is like, look, if I can sort of get this one right, if we think about like, oh, okay, look, I need this one to sort of be over here, right? Like, yes, we can consider where the bone is going to be, right? And that will help us. It'll help us understand that, again, as the leg gets lifted up, it tends to kind of come up a little bit higher than you might imagine. And that, I think, is a really sort of useful thing. Now, this gives us a pretty good indication of what's happening with the primary forms. And this is often what you're actually doing, is figuring out what are your primary forms and then sort of moving them around. But it can be really useful to sort of combine these a little bit and make sure that, again, you're getting a good mix of these ideas. Because the question is, how do you actually go about starting? All right, so let's look at a few different sort of angles that we're going to typically be dealing with in this situation. We might have the sort of front angle where, again, what we're going to have is a pretty simple front-on explanation. And the way that I typically break this down, again, is with the Loomis sort of skeletal sort of version. So I'm looking to have the proportionally these pelvic sort of areas. I'm looking to have these line up widthwise with the width of the torso. Next thing, again, I'm definitely going to use that skeletal construction and idea. And again, what you'll kind of see is that it's probably actually, if I sort of look at the anatomy, right, it's going to work a little bit more like this, because you'll notice that the side of the ribs, the pelvis, and the side of the sort of legs tend to sort of line up, right? So you're going to find some sort of proportion like that sort of works, right? And if we think about where's my center line, right? My center line is down here. Now, that's sort of, how we would think about blocking in or drawing this first front view, right? So if we think about front, the other sort of view you'd probably be looking at would be the side. And these are just sort of static, right? Which is sort of the best way to start. Obviously, if you're, going to pose things, then it gets a little bit more complicated. Maybe we'll do a second video where we unpack that a little bit more. But let's just start with static, because that gives us a pretty good indication of how that sort of functions. Right. Gonna have up here somewhere. And the other one we'd be dealing with is the back view. So hopefully you can see the red marker again. It'll help me because I'm gonna do some of the finished lines that we need to think about with the darker color, because a lot of this is actually picking out, right? A big part of this is picking out which lines do you actually need to draw. And that's where you sort of see those specific marks and things in that Frazetta book, right? Often you're actually just looking for a few lines that we'll talk about. Right. So again, we've got this type of anatomical structure. So again, just being simple, cartoony. I'm being probably a little bit more realistic than I normally would with my style, but just explaining the idea. The more you look at those particular anatomy books and figure out how that stuff works, the better that will be. Right, which is to say you basically add as much anatomical accuracy as you need. All right, so typically what we're looking for if we look at the front view, and I'll make this kind of a, maybe we'll sort of make it a feminine figure, because that way, again, we can sort of look at how the masculine musculature just, directly translates. Even though, again, for a female figure, we would probably, push the pelvis out a little bit, push the rib cage in a little bit. But yeah, same sort of idea. So with the front, what we're typically looking for are a few simple lines. You're going to be looking for the crease lines that come down here. You're obviously going to be looking for, sort of the mass of the genitalia. And you're going to be looking for where the belly button is, and also where the line of your sort of stomach is going to start. Again, if you have some sort of stomach fat there's often a few lines here that are really key. One, again, is going to be where the skin tends to crease down, and the other is going to be where the stomach tends to kind of create its own little line down here. Now, the other thing we're going to have to find is, again, depending on the pose, right, which musculature are we going to find. So if we're just going to stick with looking at the front, again, we'll sort of try and figure this out. And this is typically how we would work it. So what you can kind of see is that, again, if we sort of think about the sort of feminized figure, we're going to tuck the waist in a little bit. Right, just make that sort of clear. So what we're doing is connecting the top, right, the rib cage, this form, with this form. Now from the side, again, what we're just looking at is this curve, right, like what's happening here. We're going to maintain the center line, and this is where, again, it helps us to understand what's happening from the side. So what's typically happening from the side is that we have the pelvis here, Right, again, make this a little bit more specific. What we're sort of going to see is, again, we have sort of the rib cage, and then, right, rib cage is sort of going to be around here, but the musculature is going to sort of tuck in under, right? So we're going to see this form kind of disappearing in there, and then the leg is going to come over here. So from a major sort of anatomical point of view, again, this is a big part of what we are going to see. So often what we're trying to do is find these different forms depending on, you know, what view we're looking at. So if we look at it here, what we need to consider is a couple of key points. One is, where does the actual sort of pelvis end? Obviously, it's the sort of anatomy is going to be different on the male and female, but typically on the female figure, right, it's going to sort of end at the bottom of the pelvic bone, right? So we're going to sort of end around here. That's what's happening. And you're going to sort of have typically like a mound of the pelvis that, of sort of the pelvic bone, that's really going to be its own sort of anatomical point. Now, the other forms we're going to have are obviously these abdominal forms. And this is where, again, what you typically find is, you know, above that, we're going to have the abdominal muscles. And this is where looking at Hogarth really helps, right? Because he gives you a lot of information about what is happening with that center line. And it's often the interplay of these forms that, you know, gives you the lines that you actually need to make. So here, again, what we're going to typically find is, okay, there is just being pretty rough with the proportions here. But again, what you can kind of see is I'm going to have this form, right, of the leg come down. And I'm just roughing this in, just being super simplified with it, right? But this is kind of what we're dealing with if we aggregate all of these muscles. Now, from an anatomical point of view, what we're trying to do is find the hips, right? So we're trying to find these points here, because that's where, right, that's where that sort of marker is going to be. Again, all of this changes depending on actual specific anatomy, etc. But again, I'm just sort of being general to begin with. So again, what you might find is, depending on, again, the specific anatomy, you might see the glutes behind, depending on the angle, depending on the anatomy. But it is good to sort of put those in there, because that does give you that sort of complete understanding of what's happening with the anatomy. Now, the other sort of areas that are going to be useful are these edges of the bone here, right? It's this thing. So we're finding where we sort of hit the hips, bomb, and we're finding where, right, we sort of hit the actual bone, and it's that is going to give us a good indication of where to change form, right? So we're going down, then we hit the hip, right? Then we come in, and all of these things are going to change depending on, you know, a million anatomical factors and specific things. But if you're looking at reference and you understand the basic anatomy that underlies all humans, then it'll be very easy for you to extrapolate and be like, oh, okay, I see what's happening there, right? There's a little bit extra mass here. There's a little bit more fat here. This person has very wide hips. All of these things are going to play into it. But typically what we're sort of after is you're trying to understand this line here. What is happening with the... right? What is happening with this? Just rough a few of those things in there. What's happening with this line? So here, again, you're going to have the belly button there, right? Navel. And then we're going to have this which is kind of more or less where those sort of abdominals, your sort of six-pack or whatever is going to end, right? But those muscles do actually continue down here. So this is often sort of a fat deposit line, just sort of a particular line that tends to appear. So it's often this one that we're looking for. We're also looking for the bottom of the pelvis. And then we're looking for this line, right, which is, again, going to vary a lot depending on the anatomy. But this really is just the line that is the crease that needs to happen when you've got all this kind of stuff happening there and you need your skin to kind of fold over. So you typically will find this sort of crease, right? And again, I'm being very, very simple with this, but this is kind of the, you know, the simple anatomy that is going to help, right? And it's these lines that we're often looking for. So we're doing all this work, but what we're sort of trying to find are these points where we deviate from the rib cage, we hit over here, right? So if we sort of look at the finished drawing, boom, this is sort of what we're trying to find. Right, then often again you're going to have the belly button, right? We might have again a small sort of indication of this, and then really what we're after is this particular line here. And even to the point where, you know, you might not see a lot of that, you know, same line on the other side, but the more that you can understand, right, exactly what's happening there, the better. So again, I'm being pretty vague, but hopefully you get the general idea. And again, depending on the musculature, right, these lines are going to sort of overlap in different ways, right? You might find, again, there's sort of more fat on the inner thighs. That's going to change this line just a little bit. All of these things are going to change, but what you're trying to do is find the form and find these particular lines. And understanding this, you know, underneath is going to help. Now, again, what happens if we sort of, you know, lift up one of these legs? Well, again, what's going to happen is it's going to pivot from here, right? And then again, you kind of see we might get the bone sort of coming up here. Now, again, it's the critical, you know, understanding of what, you know, tends to happen, right, with this secondary form. So we're still going to see the glute. And again, depending on anatomy, depending on all these other things, right, we're going to see something like this, which again is still that same basic primary form, right? And we're just going to, all that's going to happen is we're just going to modify and see a bit of this extra sort of anatomy on there. And, you know, this is where, again, reference is sort of helpful depending on exactly, you know, sort of what you're trying to draw. But this is where we understand how to modify these things. So if I was to draw it here, right, this is mostly what is changing. And it's just your study of all the different muscles, right, where they are, what's going on, that'll kind of help you to make those changes. But this is the basic idea. So if we look at that same thing from the side, let's sharpen this pencil a little bit. Boom, 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 boom. Yeah, we're going to get a few pretty simple additions. So you can see from the side that really what we're seeing here is the glutes, and the glutes are mostly muscle, right? Whether you have glutes or not is sort of up to you, genetics, but yeah, there's certainly no bone there. And, you know, that should be obvious. You're a human, you know all these things, but it's easy to kind of, you know, maybe not exactly know what's happening there, right? Is it bone? Is it this? Is it that? Right? What's going on? So again, typically what we're going to have is we're seeing here the combination of a few things. And it can be really useful to draw through. And again, understand that what's happening is we're sort of ducking down here. Sorry, we're ducking down here. But again, the point of the pelvis is often going to be, you know, much further down than a lot of people might think, right? It's a much more sort of in. So you have this kind of curve of the upper body kind of come in there and tuck in to the pelvis. Now, what we're also going to have, if we look at it from the side, are these kind of overlapping muscles, right? Because everything sort of connects here. And this sort of does get very sophisticated and complicated. And you can kind of, study this as much as you want, depending on, how much, you need to draw striated superhero style characters. But the general idea from a primary form standpoint is, again, that we still have this bone, right? We still have this line here, right? Which is going to help us. And we're often going to see, again, a pretty sort of useful shape here, right? Where we're going to still see, right, the top of that, right? We can still sense where that pivot is, right? It can be useful to sort of put that in, right? And we're also going to see a bit of a curve, right? You can see the curve out of that muscle. So we're probably looking, again, at a form that's like a little bit more like this, right? This one's sort of coming straight down. Again, I'm getting a little bit mixed up with male, female anatomy here, but I think we'll be okay. So again, we're dealing with that. And it really is here, when you're drawing from the side, it's your understanding of where the pelvic area is, the fact that it's sort of being hidden by the, sort of side of the leg. And again, just sort of separating out what I would say is very useful, is to separate out, look, where's this leg going versus where are the glutes going? Because again, the specific line of that can be super useful, but can be super useful to just kind of put in. And again, what you're dealing with is just, how much sort of glute you want, depending on, what sort of character you're drawing. But you can see the basic idea of where that's going and what's happening there, right? There's a lot of sort of fat deposit that actually creates the shape. If you look at sort of bodybuilders, who are like really, really striated, it's a weird look, right? But that's kind of what's happening. So from a structural drawing point of view, right, this is kind of what we're trying to create in most cases, is just, let's take a bit of that rib cage off. Right, bit of this off. Typically what you're trying to draw is, right, this line here, and we're trying to find where this line sort of overlaps from a drawing point of view, or at least we're trying to understand, again, where all the form is going. Your goal is going to be very different depending on whether you're trying to create line work, right? Then you're sort of looking for these final lines. If you're painting, you're often going to be looking more for the form. But in many cases, what you're going to find is that these lines that create the outline are really mostly what you want. And again, it can be sort of good to think about where where that sort of form will change, right? So you might put a few sort of markers here and there, but a lot of that would sort of be handled at the form stage. What you can pay attention to is just sort of which form is overlaying which form. But that's the basic idea. That's sort of what we're trying to achieve. Now, if we look at the back view, again, it's sort of similar sort of idea. What we're looking for is this hip. And if we look at what's happening with the anatomy here, you can see that, again, we're sort of dealing with this V-shaped taper going down here. Right, we're going to tuck in. Right. Boom, boom, boom. And again, what we're trying to find is this. Right, we're trying to find that. We're trying to find this on the side. And again, it's a mix of trying to get, so let's see if we can sort of find center. All right, let's see if we can rough in the basic the basic form. But because I have that skeleton there, I've got a pretty good indication of where all of these different sort of elements are going. Right? And you can see that the major thing we sort of have to deal with is again, like, which of these markers do we need. So I would say at the back, one of the best sort of things that's going to really help is this sort of center line, right? Is sort of figuring out where that is, where that sort of small of the back goes, trying to get that there. And here, yeah, really mostly what you're trying to do is find the sort of anatomical information around the glutes, right? And again, what you can kind of see is that we're going to get a very similar thing here, right? Where we sort of have these muscles, right? Coming here, and it is important to sort of get right this musculature here working, although it's not often actually the line that we end up drawing. So again, always important to make that sort of distinction, right? Because often what will happen is there will be some sort of fat and other tissue that's going to sort of flesh out that area. But if you just make sure, again, you get that right, we get those lines there. Again, that will, like, most of that sort of information will be taken care of. But it is really these points, right? We've got 1, right? Sort of 2 here, right? Sort of 2. Again, proportion of everything that's not that's not the torso is kind of off here, right? So that's really what we're doing. We're sort of thinking through where all those things are, and what we're trying to get is this line here, right? Probably this line here. And again, you might find those kind of dimples on the side, depending on, sort of genetic makeup, etc. And mostly what you're looking for are these lines, right? Like this line here. Right, again, this line here, messed it up a little bit, one at the side, right, and again, you can sort of smooth that out. Do whatever you want. Again, might be more mass here, might be more mass there, but these are the basic lines that you're, in most cases, you're going to want to find. Again, this is super cartoony, it's not sort of realistic anatomy. And again, we can, put in a few of those markers there to kind of help us feel out that space a bit. Yeah, so, hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea for, how I would go about sort of solving a lot of those sort of pelvic areas when we're dealing with this. Pretty basic concept, but again, pay attention to what the anatomy books will sort of give you, right? Again, I think there's different anatomy books that are going to help with different things, right? If you sort of got your, I'm just trying to find them here. If you sort of got your, your Loomis, it's going to give you a lot of information. It's going to give you a lot of cool pictures that, you can look at, you can have fun, enjoying the good art. It's got the mannequin system. That's really useful. If you look at, one of these, the Gottfried Bam's book, right? Again, super useful. I'm not going to flip through it because, again, there's lots of, naked photography there. I think often the trick is understanding how you combine all these things and connect them up to your particular style. And that's where what you have to develop is the process. What do you do first? What do you do second? How do you utilize this information? So, I can look at the mannequin system that Loomis really talks about. It makes very simple. It's the same sort of stuff is in here, but it's not taught in that sequence in the same way. If we look at these, lots of really, really good information in there, but you kind of have to extrapolate how to use it, right? What are you actually doing? If you look at sort of the Bone Hogarth books, then again, tons of really good drawings, good information about how to do that. But again, you don't necessarily want to draw like this. You often want to hide things, that it's more sophisticated. And that's where, you know, I often come back to paying really, really close attention to, you know, what type of artists you like, what type of work do they create, and what type of lines and forms and shapes, etc., do they actually end up finding, right? What are the important lines? What are the important forms? And how do you actually find them? Because that really is the sequence that you're trying to do, right? You're trying to find these final forms, and it can actually be one of the real tricks to this is looking at your favorite artist and sort of saying, like, what are the 5 poses they actually use, right? I mean, Frazetta is really, really good, but, you know, there's often only a few poses that, you know, really sort of get used again and again. And, you know, once you kind of understand that and like, oh, this is what I'm looking for, and the task is not always like, you know, hey, you know, you just need to find, you know, like you need to be able to draw anything. It's like, no, there's typically only certain angles that you actually draw. You need to find those first, etc., etc., etc. So understand these like connective things are very stylistically based. It's very much a matter of the progress, the process. How do you find it? How does that work, etc. But hopefully this little demo has given you a few tips and things you can use. My sort of process and the way that I personally do this and the way that I sort of tend to teach it. Anyway, let me know if you've got any comments down below, suggestions, you'd like me to go into more depth, different things. I think, you know, how the arm connects to the torso is another good one we'll do. But yeah, other than that, we'll catch you around. Happy drawing.